This session of the CRESPAR seminar was designed as a first activity within the context of an international research project called Who Cares? Rebuilding Care in a Post-Pandemic World. So rebuilding care. And it was selected by the transatlantic platform called the TAP after the RRR call for project or for submissions. In France, this project is carried out with the support of the National Agency for Research, and at international level, it is led by Nadia Araujo Guimarães from Brazil, and in France, it's driven by Elena Irata and myself, Aurélie Daman. With this project, we want to study the impact of the pandemic on the practices of caregivers as well as care recipients. For this research, we will listen to Judith Butler and Jacques Rancière on the issue of the pandemic and inequality, which will certainly shed light and provide us with important avenues to explore. Along with Judith Butler, we want to reflect on this paradigm of living where we, and I quote, we need to take care of the livable against the unlivable, prepare the conditions of a livable life in all senses of the word. The question of equality and vulnerability in the face of the virus and the question of social inequalities during the pandemic is and has been on the agenda for several weeks or months or even years. So we will listen to Jacques Rancière saying, inequality and equality are two worlds that are constantly confronting one another in any now. The first one is always there with its well-oiled mechanisms, and the second is in perpetual rebuilding. With the pandemic and globalization of the coronavirus, the assertion according to which care would only apply to dependent people really appears as totally meaningless now. We're all vulnerable, and the pandemic demonstrates the interdependence between human beings. At the same time, many research carried out since the beginning of the pandemic, like the EPICOV survey coordinated by Nathalie Bachos, demonstrated inequalities in the face of contamination and mortality, depending on where you worked, your type of job, etc. And that revealed inequalities in connection with gender and race issues. Likewise, the Coconut survey or research carried out by INED and coordinated by Anne Lambert and Joanny Caillouette-Ramblière showed that inequalities were strengthened in all axes: housing, working conditions, income, social relations, etc. We can also talk about the work of Jean-François Lahaye in the north of Paris, who said these daily lives were shattered by the pandemic and its impact. Then we will talk about issues of equality and inequality with regards to social class inequalities, racial inequalities, gender inequalities. These are crucial. Judith Butler and Jacques Rancière are challenging the notions of pandemic and interdependence, equality and inequality in the face of coronavirus. Judith Butler talks about pandemic in the light of phenomenology of senses and shows how it sheds light on inequality, interdependence, and new violences in the world. She also talks about the relationship between vulnerability and health crisis. Jacques Rancière analyzes the logic of consensus. He challenges the role of science in the pandemic and the articulation between power and science, as well as the forms of government in a pandemic situation. And both give us keys to start thinking about the answers to one question, can we start thinking about the post-pandemic world? So Judith Butler is a philosopher. She teaches at the University of California, Berkeley. Her books have finally been translated in French. So we're talking about gender trouble, the powers of mourning and violence, politics of coalition, thinking and mobilizing with Judith Butler, and the livable and the unlivable. Jacques Rancière is a philosopher. He's emeritus professor at the University of Paris Saint-Denis. He wrote many books, amongst which The Ignorant Master, The Descent to Politics and Philosophy. So we're going to hand over to Judith first, then Jacques, then they can have a conversation discussing their respective presentations, and then we'll have a discussion with everyone in the room, or those of you who'd like to ask questions via Zoom. If you're following us via Zoom, you can raise your hand virtually or drop a question into the chat box. You can, if you're watching us on YouTube, unfortunately, we won't be able to take questions from people using YouTube. We will ask you to speak loudly and clearly to a full quality of translation. Over to you, Judith.
Good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here and to be able to speak with Jacques Rancière and all of you. But I'm going to speak in English. That's what I usually do.
Regardless of where we are, and we are in many places, we live in the first part of 2022 under a new set of conditions created by the pandemic. I'm not saying that the pandemic creates one condition that can be separated from prevailing social and ecological conditions, but only that the pandemic now configures those prevailing conditions in a new way. Those prevailing conditions include environmental destruction, poverty, racism, global inequalities, social violence, including violence directed against women and sexual minorities. In these continuing pandemic times, some of us have doubtless suffered acute losses, and others may be observing those losses from safer parts of the world. But all of us have been living in relation to ambient illness and death. Death and illness are quite literally in the air. However differently we register this pandemic, and what it means to register it will prove important to what I have to say, we do doubtless understand it as global. It implicates each of us in an interconnected world, a world of living creatures whose capacity to affect one another and to be affected by one another can be a matter of life or death. I am not sure I would say that this is a common world we share, since as much as we might wish to dwell in a common world, I am not sure we currently do. The common has not yet been achieved. Perhaps it is more apt to say that there are many and overlapping worlds, for so many of the major resources of the world are not equitably shared, and there remain those who have only a small or vanished share of the world. We cannot register a global phenomenon such as the pandemic without at once registering those inequalities, and in this case, seeing those inequalities intensify. We sometimes say that those with wealth and protection live in a different world than those who do not. That is a figure of speech, but does it not also communicate a reality? Maybe we ought not to be taken seriously when we speak that way, if there is, after all, a singular world that encompasses such inequalities. But what if it remains descriptively true that some worlds are not quite part of that one world, that common world, or that there are zones of life that exist and persist outside the common or the commons. Often those who dwell in such marginal zones do the work for that common world and are tied to it through labor, but are not for that reason of that world, if by of it we mean to designate a mode of belonging. Indeed, perhaps those who constitute replaceable labor or who dwell outside the zone of productivity as recognized by capitalist metrics are considered the refuse, the waste of the common world, or the zone of criminality, black and brown life, sometimes living in debt, living, in fact, in the endless time of unpayable debt. A debt that suffuses life and survives the life of the debtor. So maybe we need to think about contiguous and overlapping worlds that are uncommon, or even, as Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have argued, belong to an underlying undercommons. That is, a zone of negligence, criminality, but also refuge, experiments in community, care, and art, acts of affirmation often undertaken without sufficient funding. If in light of all this, we still want to talk about a shared or common world, we might, with Jacques Rancière, talk about the part of those who have no part, those for whom participation in the commons is not possible, never was, or no longer is. If we were to talk about shares of the world, not financial shares, but parts of the common share that is the world, we would have to admit that there is no equitable measure for distributing equal shares of the world. A share would be a form of participation and belonging that could not be measured by economic metrics and would doubtless demand a measure beyond that metric. For we are not just talking about resources and companies in which a share of stock is to be had, but rather a common world, a sense of the common, a sense of belonging to a world, or of the world itself as a site of belonging. That is not the same, I think, as a struggle for recognition within the existing social coordinates and categories, but entails a fundamental transformation of the understanding of value. As such, it is a way of living life with the assumptions that one's life has value, a value beyond market value, that the world will be structured to facilitate one's flourishing, and that this happens or will happen not only for oneself, but for everyone else as well. Suis-je intelligible en anglais? OK. OK. Très bien. Il est très important de parler lentement. Oui. OK. Respirez un peu. OK. We are, of course, far from any idea of a common world. The pandemic and now the distribution of vaccines illuminates and intensifies racial inequalities, as we know. A large portion of pandemic pain is clustered in some parts of the subjugated and colonized world and in communities of color. In the United States, Black and brown people have been 3 times as likely to become infected with the virus as white people and twice as likely to die. The statistics cannot explain how it got to be that way, but we can assume that one reason is that it has been accepted within the so-called common world that the loss of Black life is simply not as worrisome or grievable as the loss of white life, often described simply as human life. Indeed, face to face with such statistical inequalities, we may find ourselves asking, what kind of world is it in which those statistics emerge? We can mean several things by such a question. We may be asking, what version of reality do those statistics serve? Or what world is circumscribed by the statistics themselves? Yet even as social and economic inequalities are brought into fuller relief under pandemic conditions, and a growing and vulnerable undercommons of abandonment, fugitivity, and experimental life is exposed, there is also a movement in a global direction, one that seems based on a renewed and more acute sense of mortality, coupled with a political sense of who dies early, whose death is preventable, whose death matters. For which set of living beings are there no safeguards, no infrastructural or social promise of continuity, no sense of a life with the supports required to live on? And now we see the global distribution of the vaccine and the grim reality that some countries cannot pay and have yet to see a single dose. I think Congo and Haiti, very few vaccines, less than 2% of the population vaccinated. The draw toward a global sense of the world, and let us presume that a global sense of the world is registered phenomenologically through different senses of the global, is strengthened by a common immunological predicament, even as it is one that we live out very differently depending on where we are and how we are socially positioned, if we are positioned at all within the operative sense of society. Pandemic is etymologically pandemos, all the people, or perhaps more precisely, the people everywhere, or something that crosses over or spreads over and through the people. It establishes the people as porous and interconnected. The demos is thus not the citizens of a given state, but all the people, despite the legal barriers that seek to separate them or their documented status. A pandemic operates throughout the world population, but it also afflicts the people as human creatures who bear a susceptibility to viral infection. The world that is implied is the everywhere, the pan, a world that is threaded together through infection and recovery by immunity, differential risk, morbidity, and fatality. There is no border that stops the virus from traveling if humans travel, and no social category secures absolute immunity. Indeed, the pretense of power that acts as if some are immune by virtue of their social power increases the vulnerability to infection, since it throws precautions to the wind, as we see with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and as we surely saw in lurid detail with the immediate past president of the United States. We don't have to mention his name so much. The defiance of the anti-vaxxers intensifies their susceptibility and their risk of hospitalization and death, as we see at the time of this writing in what was then the Omicron surge and now perhaps is the Deltacron surge, I'm not sure. It is as if the pandemic keeps insisting on the pan, drawing attention to the world, and the world keeps dividing into unequally exposed zones. So even though we tend to speak of the world as a singular horizon, or even expect that the word world will set the horizon to experience itself, we also talk about worlds in the plural to highlight discontinuity, barriers, and inequalities, and feel that it is imperative to do so to describe the world as it is. Oddly, we don't generally hear about worlds of the virus, but we surely could in a provisional way. If we did, that would suggest that multiple world horizons are operative, horizons that do not always exactly fuse as the hermeneutic philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer expected them to do. They would be asynchronous horizons, world limits, as it were, configured through different temporalities that overlap and diverge, but do not fully converge. Some have thought that we need to shake this notion of the world, to shake it off, and to turn to the planetary as a decidedly less anthropocentric concept. The planetary can furnish a critical perspective on geographical maps that are invariably geopolitical, whose lines are the accomplishments of those who vanquish national boundaries, usually forged through war or colonization. Achille Mbembe argues, and I quote, "The political in our time must start from the imperative to reconstruct the world in common," end quote. However, he argues, if we consider the plundering of the earth's resources for the purposes of corporate profit, privatization, and colonization itself as a planetary project or enterprise, then it makes sense that the true opposition, the one that does not send us back to our egos, our barriers and identities, will be a form, and I quote, of decolonization, which is by definition a planetary enterprise, a radical openness of and to the world, this is still Mbembe, a deep breathing for the world as opposed to insulation, end quote. The planetary opposition to extraction and systemic racism ought to then deliver us back to the world, or let the world arrive, as if for the first time, in a way that allows for a deep breathing, a desire we all now know if we have not already forgotten how to wish for it. In fact, I very much doubt that any of you are right now involved in very deep breathing. And I say that not because I'm from California. Okay, it's just because breathing is a precarious kind of exercise right now. There are, of course, many ways to approach this question of the world, including the now complicated debates about world literature. Sometimes there we find distinctions like European literature and world literature, as if the world is every other place outside of Europe or the Anglo-American context. In other words, the center of the world gets a place name, but all those other locations of literature are elsewhere and therefore the world. A vast domain, and without proper names, the world becomes an elsewhere in relation to the centers of power. In contrast, the important work of decolonial feminist Maria Lugones, who in 1987 wrote on world traveling, offers a counter-imperialist account of moving from one's own world to another's world in order to undergo a transformation in the direction of a more loving perception of alterity. That work is now 33 years old, yet continues to address readers across the world at the same time that it marks those separated worlds, underscoring the risk of disorientation in entering another world, another language, or epistemic field. Lugones underscores the importance of letting one's epistemic field, one's very sense of the limit and structure of the world, become upended and reoriented in the course of an encounter in which one becomes willing to suspend or forfeit the coordinates of the world one has known in an effort to reach and apprehend another. The pandemic has brought with it this oscillation between world, singular, and worlds, plural. Whereas some insist that the pandemic intensifies all that was already wrong with the world, others suggest that the pandemic opens us to a new sense of global interconnection and interdependency. Both propositions are wagers that emerge in the midst of a continuing contemporary disorientation. The pandemic distributes itself in waves and surges, and they correlate phenomenologically with hope and despair. No matter how located and differentiated the ways the pandemic registers for people across the world, It remains a phenomenon, a force, a crisis, even a condition that extends throughout the world, and that, considered as a condition of the present world, figures the world or gives forth the world in some quite specific ways. In other words, no one, no matter where they are, is not thinking about the world. This is especially true given the assault on Ukraine. I think we also ask ourselves not just what is happening there, but what kind of world are we living in? It's a crisis that implicates us in such a way that we start asking about the world. And though some regions have seem to have escaped the worst ravages of the coronavirus by chance, or have contained its effect through deliberate forms of social conduct, no region is in principle immune. No region, no bounded entity, indeed no discrete body, is by definition immune in advance. For a pandemic names a global susceptibility, a potential suffering that belongs to human life in its immunological relationship to the world, one that is part of the world for now and perhaps for an indefinite period of time. Once it becomes endemic, it will be an enduring part of the world. Interestingly, we don't have a noun for that. We don't say there is an endemic unleashed on the world. No, a pandemic can be unleashed, but an illness that is considered endemic becomes part of the fabric of the world itself, the experience of the world, a new sense of the world when all the unleashing has come to an end. It moves from noun to adjective, from a temporary condition of the world to a permanent feature. But even if this pandemic were to fade away, immunological vulnerability certainly will not. And if we hate the virus for the vulnerability it exposes, we ought not for that reason conclude that the absence of the virus will eradicate that vulnerability. It will not. Immunologically considered, the vulnerability foregrounded by the virus is a function of the fact that the exogenous is always a part of any organism. Animals, including human ones, ingest, absorb, and breathe elements of an external world in order to live. In this way, the human body, to live, can never be sealed off from what is external. Its life resides in the interaction with externality. And this position has been articulated by co-constructionists such as Thomas Pradue, and has implications for how we think about danger. The problem with the virus was never that it was foreign, but rather that it is new. And that is why our immunological systems, or most of ours, have no ready way to recognize it and to fight against it without the assistance of vaccines or antibodies, and that come to recognize it through exposure. The thesis of co-constructionists is that the organism is constructed by its environment even as it constructs that environment in return. And we see, I think, a version of this in Anne Fausto Sterling's work as well, with important implications for reformulating the sex-gender distinction in light of the nature-culture distinction. The aim of a co-constructionist theory is less to distinguish what belongs to the self and what does not, than to understand how the external world is part of the body and has to be. Thus, the immunological problem produced by pandemics is an unpreparedness for what is unprecedented. Of course, if there were no analogies to other epidemics produced by SARS viruses, then the adenovirus vaccines would have been declared useless from the start. And messenger RNA vaccines, which seek to mimic the shape and spike of the virus, producing a new object shape for the immune system through a life-saving simulacrum, are crucial to developing the immunological capacity to identify, react, and to fight it. Both types of vaccines rely on the possibility of recognizing and reacting to a similar structure. Both analogy and mimicry are thus crucial to strengthening the immune system in this context. At the same time, however, the immune system is not only challenged by what comes from outside, but also from the organism itself, which is why autoimmune attacks, those waged by the organism against itself, are very often the inflammatory consequence of new forms of viral infection. I underscore this point because at the outset of the pandemic, the virus was figured by media reports as coming from a foreign place, China, Brazil, South Africa, and described as an unwanted immigrant imported without proper papers into the body politic, at which point public health, at least within the US nation state, was said to be imperiled by what is foreign. That was and remains more of an immigration analogy within a nationalist imaginary than an immunological model on which anyone can rely. I underscore this point because, as we know, the organism cannot survive without ingesting or taking in foreign elements. One is tempted to conclude that the organism can be more acutely at risk from its autoimmune condition than from anything foreign. But once we accept the co-constructionist model that establishes the foreign at the heart of the living organism, that prioritizes the interaction between body and world as they construct each other, and that this is the life of the body itself, then the point is not to defend oneself against what is foreign. That would be fatal. Rather, the aim is to transform the interaction so that the body can live with and accommodate what is new without risk of debilitation or death. The world is not just out there as the backdrop for human action or the field for human intervention. On a daily basis, bits of the world are incorporated into the body itself, suggesting a vital connection between body and world. This can have devastating effects when toxic air affects and degrades the lungs, when lead in water becomes part of the bones, when environmental poisons enter and imperil the body in its tissues and ligaments. The point is not to negate the external world. That is an impossibility. The point is to clear the air and water of toxins so that living creatures may rely upon them without fear of mortal consequences. Call me a Lucretian if you must, but we won't be able to understand shared vulnerability and interdependency unless we concede that we pass the air we breathe to one another, that we share the surfaces of the world, and that we cannot touch another without also being touched. We lose sight of that overlapping reciprocity when, for instance, we forget that being infected and becoming infectious are linked together. What happens to me, the risk I run, happens to another, at least potentially. This link between us can be fatal, but it can also surely be life-sustaining as well. The pandemic upends our usual sense of the bounded self, casting us as relational, interactive, refuting the ego-logical and self-interested basis of ethics itself, indeed refuting forms of individuality that correspond all too well with capitalist metrics. The pandemic condition links us, establishing our ties as both precarious and persistent. The metric that tells us which lives are worth safeguarding and which lives are not is there to be seen and opposed, as is the metric that establishes acceptable levels of death. Universities and businesses have made such determinations, even as they deny that they do. In fact, our liberated status right now in the street, etc., assumes that some people will never be protected or cannot be protected. But the utilitarian calculus, right, allows that group of people who are most vulnerable to be considered dispensable. There's always, I would suggest, a dispensable population factored into such equations. There are always people who can be sacrificed to make such equations work and to open the market, which is apparently the most important thing. Well, you have to open the market to win an election. Okay, we could go down that road. Okay. And such decisions to open in the midst of pandemic peaks indirectly target Black and brown people, the elderly, the migrants, those with pre-existing health conditions, the poor, the homeless, those with disabilities, and the incarcerated, including those stalled at the border or subject to overpopulated detention camps. In opposition to all these forms of destitution, there are, as you know, new and renewed mobilizations, and they may be gaining in strength and number. They are each appalled by the world as it is currently constituted and endeavor to constitute a different sense of a world, even as it is not fully within their power to make the world anew, for human action is not at the center of the world, but a newer world does emerge once the conditions and limits to human action are known. Climate destruction is reversed, and the ethical bonds between us set limits to self-aggrandizement and the economic calculations that depend upon the dispensability of those most vulnerable. Thank you.
Does the mic work? Yes, it does. Okay, so first I would like to thank Elena and Aurélie for inviting me, and I'd like to thank Judith Butler for being here with me and with all of us. So first I'd like to clarify the scope of my presentation. I'll talk about the impact of the pandemic, and I'll show how state entities have managed the pandemic on the issue of inequality. So I will not talk about the pandemic and its impact on the development of inequalities. However, I do not intend to ignore the importance of these impacts, which were undeniably revealed. Numerous studies have confirmed what was already clear from observation, namely that the pandemic and lockdown measures have had a particular impact on the most vulnerable populations of poor countries deprived of vaccines, hoarded by rich countries, seniors in nursing homes who were isolated, deprived of contact with their loved ones, overworked caregivers and hospital staff, precarious workers who were furloughed, poorly housed families forced to adapt to the need of working from home while keeping their children at home, women who were the first victims of the retreat in social life into a domestic space, which is still largely structured by male power. So in all these areas and in many others, the pandemic situation has both highlighted and aggravated a reinforcement of those inequalities which are part of the current world order. But I will not be talking about this because the focus of my work is not about inequalities, but about inequality in singular and equality as such. This emphasis on the singular word may appear to be contrary to the sound methodological principles in social sciences. These principles require that priority be given to the study of inequalities, which are measurable relationships that can eventually be modified by reformist policies that are accurately informed by scientific data. My point of view is just the opposite. It is that the development of inequalities can only be thought as an effective global process of production and reproduction of inequality. This is what I learned from Jacques Rancière's work on intellectual emancipation. Equality and inequality are not measurements. These are not relationships between magnitudes that would fluctuate one direction or another. These are antagonistic processes. These are concrete ways of building the reality of a common world. These are ways of shaping the world that give effect to antagonistic principles and nourish specific passions that nourish them in return. From this point of view, the question goes far beyond the fact that the pandemic has unequally affected people depending on their age, their physical vulnerability, their social status, or the country or continent in which they live. My purpose is to see how the pandemic and the measures taken by our governments to combat the pandemic have helped consolidate a world which is thought and organized according to the inequality rationale. In order to think about this inequality rationale, we must therefore proceed in an apparently paradoxical manner. We need to look less at the inequality of its effects than to their equality, to afford less interest in what it does to the most vulnerable than to what it does equally to everyone, big or small. It also means that we need to be less interested in what it has done to increase our weakness than what it has done to diminish our strength, or more specifically, to diminish our ability to act as equals, or our ability to create a world of equals. From this perspective, a good starting point for us to start thinking would be a sentence from a Chinese journalist quoted by Slavoj Žižek. He said, "If China valued freedom of expression, there would be no coronavirus crisis." This cause and effect relationship seems absurd if taken literally. There is no causal relationship between freedom of expression and the circulation of a virus. But it does make sense if we talk not about the virus as such, but about the pandemic situation as an object of government. And this is what I'm going to talk about now. So it may be slightly different from what Judith talked about, but we can talk about it later. So in this case, what we can say is that the pandemic situation stages a fundamental antagonistic relationship between two rationales. The egalitarian rationale based on the assumption that we human beings have the capacity to reflect, discuss, and act in common, and the inegalitarian rationale radicalized by the Chinese government, which means that these same human beings are incapable to access proper understanding of a situation and adopt behaviors in keeping with this understanding. No doubt there are many different ways of implementing this inegalitarian rationale. Our governments never put in jail those who shared information or warnings about the health situation. They do not gag freedom of expression on principles only. But on the other hand, they too operate on the assumption that the majority of people are incapable of dealing with any situation involving risks for the community. They claim a monopoly of expertise or competence on how to deal with these situations, even if it means that they have to be on public TV sets several times a day telling us, let's all fight the virus together. This monopoly on how to deal with these situations is exercised through two structuring notions: insecurity and consensus. Insecurity is the category into which any situation that exceeds the normal order falls. Financial crisis, social protest, terrorist attack, health or climatic disaster, etc. So that's a notion that non-differentiates all these phenomena. It places threats to the population and threats to the state power from the population on the same footing. It makes both threats the object of a specific concern that can only be managed by those who exercise state power and by the experts whose knowledge guide their decisions. This decision-making process involves a second structuring concept, that of consensus. Consensus does not mean an agreement as a result of a discussion. It means an agreement on the fact that there is nothing to discuss, because the objectivity of facts leave room to one analysis only, one decision only, the only decision that's dictated by necessity as defined by science. The rationale defined by these two notions of insecurity and consensus is thus doubly unequal. It doubly denies the capacity of people. It structures a community which is defined by the privilege of a tiny minority, which feel that they are the only ones capable of thinking and acting. So they have a privilege over a huge minority called a population, which can be threatening sometimes, but is always threatened. And this power is justified by the authority of science. But in our societies, science is three things at the same time, three things which are inextricably linked. Firstly, it's a body of verified knowledge in specific areas. Second, it's an institution within which this knowledge is produced and exercised, an institution that fits in the social hierarchy of our society, and as such, it exercises an authority not only on its own objects, but on social life in general and the state decisions that govern it. And thirdly, science is also the ideology of science, not ideology as the altar of science, as discussed in Althusser's time, but the ideology of science, that which legitimizes its social authority. The ideology of science gives science a general authority in addition to the knowledge produced by such or such particular field of science. This knowledge is the knowledge of necessity, the possibility to formulate what's necessary. So it's a knowledge that can be applied to any situation and which can dictate the consensual answer as being the only possible answer. The ideological authority of science is therefore fundamental and linked to the idea of necessity, i.e., the idea that there is no choice. And it's this authority that articulates power and science and which regulates the consensual order. The articulation of state power with economic science, that is to say, with a certain type of economic science which imposes as an objective scientific necessity the law of a particular economic system, that of absolute and globalized capitalism. In our country, the main requirement for the system to work is that individuals are isolated and that their collective capacity to act and use knowledge that belongs to anyone is destroyed. This leads to the destruction of large production units, the maximum individualization of forms of work through various means, it's a restriction of labor rights and labor laws, and the undermining of public services. What the authority of science feeds is the replacement of a social fabric of solidarity by a multitude of isolated individuals in the face of a global financial power. And our states are contributing to this by destroying forms of labor rights protection and social solidarity systems, but also by increasingly restricting freedoms of assembly and freedom of demonstration. The isolation of individuals from the global financial power is thus doubled by their isolation from the power of the state. And it is in this context in which the pandemic occurred. And therefore it was managed according to the security consensus paradigm, by denying the capacity of the multitude, by radically isolating individuals, and by concentrating all decision-making powers over collective life in the hands of the state power alone, which in turn was inspired by science. So on the one hand, this management style is consistent with the security consensus paradigm which governs our societies. But on the other hand, it clearly goes beyond the usual exercise of power and increases it. It's this relationship between the normality of a mechanism and its exceptional radicalization that we must address. And at the heart of this relationship, we need to address the role played by the authority of science. The special feature in this situation is that the authority of science was based on the most radical authority ever exercised over human life, namely death. Death, not metaphorical death, but real death. Not death announced as the likely consequences of certain chains of causes and effects, but death that you encounter suddenly. And until then, the consensus rationale was essentially based on economic science, considered as the science of material means in order to ensure the life of society. But this science was determined by economic science, and its validity was disputable in theory. The necessity of factory closure, the shrinkage of workers' rights, all this could be challenged, could be returned to its status of a mere choice serving the special interests of some at the expense of the interest of the community at large. And this challenge could be acted upon by the communities affected by these measures. Therefore, the authority of science was thus ultimately reduced to the capacity of financial and state powers to impose their decisions against those they targeted. But death cannot be contested, and the sick do not form the community. As for medicine, it's only marginally contested in its role as science, protecting human bodies from the causes of mortality. So the major fact that modifies and intensifies the inegalitarian rationale of the consensus security order is in the service of the double government and scientific authority, is the intervention of the absolute master, according to Hegel, the only one capable of providing a basis to absolute priority of science, namely death. To such a point that a predominant interpretation of the pandemic exception emerged. One brings into play two essential notions: an interpretation of the authority of science, biopower, and an interpretation of its mode of exercise as a form of government, the state of exception. A brief study of these two notions, biopower and the state of exception, is therefore necessary now, and we need to think about their role in the pandemic situation. So this review needs to start with two comments. The biopower state of exception pair is based on the same fundamental rationale as the security consensus pair. Likewise, it's composed of two notions which can be totally indifferent to the singularity of the events they apply to. As generally used today, the word biopower has totally forgotten the specificity of the concept of biopolitics, which was the assumption proposed by Michel Foucault. Any power exercised over the lives of human beings has become susceptible to be qualified as biopower. And since all exercise of power has to do with the lives of humans one way or another, the two notions end up being mere synonyms, and saying that our governments have implemented the practices of biopower means to say that they have actually implemented the practices of power. And the same applies to the state of exception in my mind. Those who saw lockdown orders as the imposition of a state of exception had been explaining for years that this state of exception was the very essence of modern power, and that we were all living under its regime. In this double aspect, the pandemic event, which was supposed to be the ultimate revelation of the triumph of a specific form of power, is in reality devoid of any singularity. And this is why one of the proponents of this point of view, after he denied the reality of the pandemic, was capable of saying that it was indifferent for him to know whether it was real or not, since it was a mere pretext to establish a state of exception. The The indifference to reality of the event thus combines with the total lack of specificity regarding the notions used to account for its management, and more particularly the role of medical science. We all know that Giorgio Agamben did not hesitate to reduce the latter to a pure religion of health, a religion of health that would have in some way succeeded to that of Christ the Redeemer. However, it seems that any understanding of the pandemic situation and of its inequality effects must be rooted in the reality of the event and in the effects of this reality on the very form of exercise of scientific power. Starting from the reality of the event means starting from its contingency and unpredictable nature. In order for the management of the pandemic to be an implementation of the biopower paradigm, it would have had to be the consequence of long-planned power strategies with specific attention paid to the health of people and the factors that threaten it. However, the conditions under which medical authority was exercised during the pandemic were quite the opposite. Not only did this situation catch governments unprepared, but it also occurred in a context where scientific management of health by our governments had been guided not so much by medical science data, but by official economic science. And what the latter had planned was to restrict funding allocated to healthcare and therefore the capacity of hospitals. So in summary, the authority of economic science had programmed the inability of medical science to respond to large-scale threats to people's health. And it is therefore in this context that the authority of medical science was exercised, more specifically in our country, but also in many European countries. Authority was exercised over an unforeseen phenomenon and in conditions of government unpreparedness. This is why this exercise was based less on the application of scientific knowledge than on the administrative authority of medicine and the ideological authority of science. The essential measure proposed by the government-appointed scientific authority, that measure of lockdown, was essentially motivated not by the power of medicine, but we should say by its powerlessness, as it resulted partly from the negligence of state power, partly from its deliberate choices. The figures on which the experts based their demand for lockdown orders were those of hospital capacity, which had been reduced by the fiscal choices made by the government in power. So lockdown measures were therefore imposed not as an implementation of a desire for lockdown itself, but because of the lack of any other form of prevention measures, such as masks, tests, or vaccines. Nonetheless, this measure was implemented and had two major consequences. First, it led to the de facto isolation of people. Individuals were rendered incapable of carrying out their ordinary social activities. They were not capable of meeting and acting in common. It thus led to an increased dependence on the two powers that are exercised today, precisely by separating individuals and by privatizing all social relations. And I'm talking here about the financial and state powers. Not only has the pandemic forced people to stay at home, but it also was, and that's the second major consequence, it also was an opportunity to strengthen the forms of dependence that are exercised from a distance and through distance. We know that remote working found a new opportunity to increase its double resource. First, submission of individuals deprived of means to form a community. Secondly, the deletion of the very limits of working time. We know that distance learning has also confirmed its vocation as to be the transmission, to be the teaching of the future, that is to say, the teaching of a specific future, that of transmission via computers of knowledge elaborated by ad hoc commissions. So this was an improvised laboratory, really, for the exercise of a type of reinforced power by the triple economic, state, and scientific authority. The fact remains that this exceptional situation is the result of a bricolage that was exercised in compliance with the normal rationale of security and consensus, with no relation to the implementation of the biopolitical exception paradigm. Asking people to stay at home is not really the best way to submit them to the power of exception. This power is usually exercised by the opposite form when the state police intrudes into people's home, for instance. In order to qualify the reinforcement of the ordinary inegalitarian rationale as the intrusion of a new biopolitical paradigm, I had to rely less on the description of the mechanisms of power that were implemented and look at the assertions concerning their effects on individuals. For biopower to be proven, it must be shown to be active not only in the decisions of the state power, but in the minds of all. This is the specific object of Giorgio Agamben's demonstration in the various articles he wrote about the pandemic. Biopower, he said, should have imposed itself by creating a panic and a terror among individuals, leading them to relinquish all their social relations and to voluntarily submit to a religion of health. And he also says, in another of his articles, he says, biosecurity can be seen as a government device that results from the conjunction between the new religion of health and state power with its state of exception. Our society no longer believes in anything other than naked life. It's obvious that Italians are willing to sacrifice practically everything, normal living conditions, social relations, work, even friendships, to avoid an illness which, for the time being, at least, is not statistically all that serious. End of quote. Well, I cannot answer for Italians who are taken to task by their fellow citizen. However, I feel that this description is far from the reality we experienced in our countries. We have hardly witnessed any panic, and rather than a deliberate relinquishment of all social relations, we saw an effort to maintain them as far as the situation allowed. General compliance with restrictive conditions that were imposed by the government. But this compliance was guided by the fear of compromising the health of others as much as by a personal health concern. And the so-called religion of health was rather an awareness of the plight of hospitals and the work of carers. So in other words, the way in which the pandemic has taken hold of our brains and commanded our submission to state and medical authority, so real submission, so the way this happened is both simpler and more subtle than biopower theorists would like us to believe. It's a way of obeying which is based not on faith, but on defiance or on mistrust. What I mean is that obedience took the form of a distant cooperation that was provoked not by the force of a state of exception or a salvationist ideology, but rather by a sense of failure of our governments and an understanding of the limits of the capacity of our medical establishments to deal with the pandemic. We obeyed to our governments not because of their strength, but because of their weakness. And we did so with the purpose of not aggravating the peril created for everyone by this very weakness. In other words, and there I agree with Judith Butler, we did this because we felt we belonged to a community that is both wider and deeper than the one managed by our rulers. We also did so because we felt that we had nothing to propose as alternative measures, no clear knowledge on which to base practical opposition to the state's handling of the pandemic. This is why the overall opposition to this system was reduced to arguing not about the alternative measures that should have been taken in order to fight the pandemic, but about its pure and simple reality. When you have nothing to propose in front of the state's handling of a situation, there are two alternatives. The first being to outright deny the situation, and the second being to move to an easier terrain, that of the causes of the situation and of its effects. And in fact, the protest literature that accompanied the lockdown period took on two essential characteristics. First, it investigated the structural causes of the pandemic, namely the misdeeds of Anthropocene or Capitalocene. And second, it developed the proposal for the post-pandemic world that was supposed to emerge at the end of the lockdown period. What flourished during lockdown, in a form obviously intensified by the unexpected increase of free time, are two classic types of protest discourse. The two usual ways in which the inability to break the consensus security circle is compensated for. First, we blame the remote causes of the situation that we suffer. And second, we state what the world should be like once it has ceased being what it is. So on the one hand, we point a finger, and on the other hand, from this demonstration of the cause of evil, we infer that things cannot go on like this, and that things will change because they must. In a nutshell, we oppose a government which subjects us to the law of necessity. We show a causal chain that carries a higher necessity. It is this recourse that has led to an inability to implement or even conceive different ways of reacting to the pandemic. What was opposed to a power based on the dual institutional and ideological authority of science was the simple, naked ideology of science, the old progressive belief that the world is going to change when science has proven that it goes wrong. This belief is not just a response to a sense of powerlessness, it itself maintains this powerlessness. I would like to conclude briefly now. The reality of the pandemic situation and the concrete ways in which we've adapted to it refutes the great explanatory models which are adapted to any situation and therefore to none in particular. We were not crushed by the power and by the state of exception, but by our very inability to imagine other means than those offered by our rulers to respond to an exceptional situation. And that is, in a sense, where the problem lies. The reality of the pandemic is far from the great models of exception power, but in that it sheds an even greater light on our increased inability to think and build a world of equals capable of confronting the powers that govern the world. Thank you.
So I'm going to give you the floor back to you so that you can explain how you think about the possibility or the case, the one or the other, or one with the other, because this dialogue was the starting point of this seminar, of today's seminar. So one way of getting together is the fact that you both saw that it was the most precarious, the most vulnerable people that had the largest impact. So delegating the recent report showed that the inequalities increased, just as Jacques was saying. Also, the fact that the lack of preparation is something that has never been seen before and was not anticipated by governments. Jacques and Judith do not talk about inequalities, but inequality and equality. But Jacques talks about consensus. Beyond statistical equality that Judith is talking about, we need to look at renewed mobilizations and the effort to create a new world, taking into account the distinction between world and worlds in the plural. So in this perspective, Jacques Rancière can tell us what he thinks, and then the um, discrepancy between some of the things he saw with the health crisis. I can also quote the things that are closer because she talks those who have no parts, and Jack is talking about the role of the state. So I don't know if you would like to take the floor briefly, or before we give the floor to people in the room, would you?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jacques, for your very thoughtful remarks. I appreciated them. I am noticing that when you talk about a global process of production and reproduction of inequality, and I'm wondering if the global process works the same way everywhere, or whether we have to ask with Stuart Hall how the global is lived out at local levels. Or in different ways. I mean, otherwise the global becomes a kind of abstraction that encompasses all regions and localities equally, and that is, of course, an inequality, or it is to treat them unequally. So, I am mindful that in the U.S., for various reasons, there was no curfew, there was no police control on the street. There was no, there were masking rules and efforts to make guidelines, but it was so decentralized and chaotic that we did not have a strong sense that state power was surveying us. In fact, what we were for the most part wanting was something called good government, or a social state that actually made provisions for people's health, right? So I'm thinking that in your remarks, the state and government are perhaps two different concepts, but also the surveillance state is not the same as the social state, which in the United States we've never seen, and which many countries have never seen, right? We have no concept of a social state. I mean, we've had ideas about it. We have Social Security and the library system. That's basically our socialism. It's really pathetic. So what happens when states abandon their populations and simply decide to let people die? And that was, in fact, Trump's, there I said it, his decision. He said, yes, some people will die. The strong will survive, he said, citing social Darwinism, right? And yes, the weak will be gone, but that's okay. So what is this? If we go back to Foucault on biopouvoir, there are two modalities of death dealing. One of them is state violence, explicit killing, bombing, torturing, death penalty. The other one is letting people die or leaving them to die. And that kind of negligence, or that kind of systematic targeting of populations as dispensable, was the situation we were in, where healthcare was not required, was not available, was not affordable, and has not been for a very long time, especially in rural, poor, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities. So the surveillance state has been at the center of Italian and French discussions. I actually know some Moscow anarchists who are interested in Agamben for that reason, and they should be. But I wonder what we can say about the way capitalism works in some state apparatuses where systematic abandonment is state policy. So they're not surveying, they are looking away. In fact, if we talk about the gaze, they're not focusing on what you do and did you leave your house at that hour and when did you come back? No, they are looking away. And then it seemed to me when you say when you discuss this processus antagonique, you suggest that equality and inequality operate within a kind of single logic, and that they are antagonisms. But I wonder if that naturalizes their relationship to one another. I think we agree that the task of politics under pandemic conditions and more generally is to create a common world in the face of profound and violent divisions. But of course, that common world has to be cannot be based on denial. It cannot be a fantasy that turns out to be in the service of intensifying inequalities. I do believe that our very capacity to create a world relies on our vulnerability, and that there is a specific power to vulnerability. There's a power to susceptibility, and even a power to fragility. So we should not think that by emphasizing the vulnerable, the precarious, and the fragile, that we will become more weak, and that the force of creation will become weakened by our ethical preoccupations with those who indeed are vulnerable and precarious. I think on the contrary, that recognizing common vulnerabilities and common fragilities is the basis of some of the most important social movements of our time. Women can be raped, which is why, and they are raped in large numbers. Trans people are harassed and killed in large numbers, right? We are identifying their vulnerability to violence, and that is why they take to the streets in hundreds of thousands, right? That's why they are demanding legal and political rights. That's why they are demanding recognition. So from that vulnerability comes political demand in a different way. They don't seek to deny vulnerability to conform with a masculinist idea of strength. When we talk about force, go back to Spinoza. Maybe these are fighting words, maybe not. But if we go back to Spinoza, our receptivity is the measure of our power, right? So our ability to be affected is the measure of our ability to act and create in the world, right? And if we deny our susceptibility, our vulnerability, we deny our capacity for passion, for sexuality, for being moved, being responsive, being receptive. All of these things we need to produce communities of care, which are outside the state, very often outside the state apparatus, very often unseen, the insurgent communities of care that are part of mobilizations that we value under the pandemic. So I want to suggest that force and creativity require vulnerability, and that we should not enter into the masculinist denial of vulnerability as somehow keeping us from acting. No, we act from it. Our rage comes from vulnerability. So does our desire. So very important, I think, for feminist philosophy, but for all those concerned with sexual politics and body politics to understand that. Also, let's think about the activism on the part of the disabled community to demand rights and to become active and recognized members of the community. That's in many parts of the world, those mobilizations have been quite fabulous, in wheelchairs or being helped and carried by others onto the street to demand public recognition and laws and public policies that refuse to isolate them or to disenfranchise them. I also think, lastly, that maybe if we think about the discontinuity between the authority of science understood economically and the authority of science understood medically, we have an opportunity to think about a science for the people, or a democratization of science. Because I'm not sure that science always serves the state or that science always serves the market. I mean, of course, we have these huge corporations, Moderna, Pfizer, BioNTech, et cetera. These are, yes, corporate powers. They are enormous corporate powers. There's no question in my mind. At the same time, there are communities of care which involve health workers, medical workers, who are giving care and who are part of communities of care that are not doing the work of the state, but are doing the work of the communities that they're serving. So there are possibilities of subverting state policy by medical workers and health workers. And I think we've seen this when they've broken the law in order to care for people better, when they've refused to conform to certain rules that don't let family and loved ones see or get near to those who are ill and dying. There are many lawbreakers who have a more radical sense of care. So I think the point for me would be to think about insurgent health workers as part of a new mobilization, and to think about what the proper recognition and payment for health workers really is, because they burn out and they cannot go back to work, or they leave their position. I think we might be witnessing a democratization of healthcare and a care about healthcare workers that is new. Okay, sorry to go on so long.
Thank you.
Parler un peu longtemps. Merci.
Well, thank you, Judith, for these comments. So, yes, very clearly, we are talking from different perspectives, because you're talking from the American perspective, from the reality of a country which has not experienced a social state as we experienced it in France, but a country where the state in Europe, the state took care of the situation impacting its citizens. But Judith talked about from a perspective of a power that lets things go, whereas my perspective is that of a citizen in a situation in which the state does not let things go. So of course, I had to define the specific type of subordination in which we held by the power which is exercised here. And it's true that here in France, power is not always might is right, which is a principle that rules the economy, that rules certain philosophy of social order in Europe. But in Europe, what was crucial was the idea that there are a certain number of rules that we have to comply with if we want the largest possible number of people to survive, and not just only the strongest and the fittest. So in Europe, the predominant effect of power was an effect of incapacitation, not abandoning us to the disease, but making us feel that we are totally incapable of reacting. And this is why I talked about a collective form of managing the pandemic. And this is why I focused on a certain type of relationships between power and science, which is normally related to economic science, were there transferred to medical science and was strengthened by medical science, because medical science is in charge of the death, the actual death, not the metaphorical death of people, but the actual death of people. So that's how I organized my presentation. And I focused on these issues of worlds, and worlds are not things that we belong to, but world as being something that's created by the activity of individual on a daily basis at any moment. So we could talk about what a common world means, and in Judith Butler's text there were specifically two definitions of common worlds: a world of interconnection, in which we are, and a common world that would be a really common world. And we could say that this common world would be a world that would allow, and I quote, to allow the capacity of each individual to flourish. So or to bloom. And that's not a common world built by economic rationale, but a common world that understands the value of individuals beyond their mere economic value. And we have all this part of your text is a bit like a comment of Kant with a distinction between two meanings of values. And you talked about this common world in which every individual would have a similar value. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the world of equality versus inequality. So my idea is not that we have to create a common world, because we are part of a common world. But now for this common world, this common world is made of different worlds, centric worlds, forgotten worlds. That's obvious. But we don't have to seek for a common world, in generally speaking, because we are in a common world. Now the question is to know which common world we're in. And my question is, what kind of common world are our powers building, and what kind of common world can we offer and in response to the one that's being built by our rulers? And from this perspective, I think there is a whole debate. We won't have time for this debate, but there would be a whole debate to have on the issue of vulnerability. Of course, I focused my analysis not on what the management of the pandemic had on the impact on our weakness, but on our strength. And when I talk about our capacity, I'm not talking about a strength like this is not the way it goes. But despite everything I placed in the center of my talk, everything is articulated around the notion of capacity. When Judith refers to the share of those who have no share, we can understand that in two ways. It's the share of those who are effectively placed in a situation of greater vulnerability. But the share of those who have no share is also the share of those who have no specific qualities, the share of anyone. And what I talked about is about how this capacity was impacted, which is the capacity of anybody, that anyone has. Then there are many questions as to what should we do with vulnerability, for instance? I didn't talk about vulnerability, but I talked about the ability of vulnerable people. So it's very close. But the idea of vulnerability is some kind of a strength that gives an ability, a capability. That might be a point of disagreement, because when the various movements she talked about, the movement of women, of minorities, of people living with one type of disability or another, well, in my opinion, what's important is not the situation of vulnerability as such, but it's mostly the decision that is made at one stage that it's not that this vulnerability does not mean that we have to live in submission. If you look at movements against rape, for instance, what was decisive, what was crucial. Yes, I had to talk about this at one stage. So it's not the feeling that we are exposing all women to this crime, but it's the fact that at one stage it's seen as not necessary. There are women who say, well, we don't have to accept a rape. We don't have to keep our mouths shut. And so it's possible to refuse to be kept silent. It's possible to consider that we're just as capable as the others of building a world. And that is a challenge to me, because do people feel capable of building a world in which some decisions are not regarded as normal, in which certain types of oppressions are not regarded as normal? I see that there is some tension between the idea of a power that is born from vulnerability itself and the idea of a power born from the refusal of any form of domination and submission driven by said vulnerability. So with regards to science now, quite clearly, I talked about the security consensus paradigm. I did not come up with proposals about science in general. And of course, there are many types of medicines that played an important role, and I agree with Judith Butler with what she said about this. But I focused on the function of science, and I talked about the security consensus paradigm, but I also shed some light on the possibility that exists to escape this rationale. And when people contest, they, in fact, readdress this security and consensus paradigm to a certain extent. That's all I could say. Well, thank you very much indeed. Maybe we can give the mic to our non-formal panelists in the room. We have a slightly different format for today. Instead of having an official panelist, we've asked various people in the room to react and speak. So maybe the first one would like to take the floor. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to our two speakers for these very stimulating presentations. I'd like to make two comments as a sociologist working in empirical sociology to shed light on the issue of reproducing inequality and thinking about diversity of worlds and population. I'm not going to argue any of your position, but my opinion, well, I'm stepping in to try and go one step further in taking into account social inequality in order to better understand what some people call vulnerability, which results from domination social relationships and better understand vulnerability to better mobilize them. So I'd like to give a sociological perspective to what you said, to deconstruct the notion of individual behind these worlds. So the notion of the pandemic revealed inequalities which were sociologically expected. There is nothing new in the inequalities that we observed. From a sociological perspective, these inequalities were expected given the spreading conditions for the virus, but also given past experience to combat other pandemics. And I'm thinking about the HIV pandemic. And we had the feeling that we were once again starting from scratch. And we know that many things could have been understood in the political management of the COVID-19 as we could have drawn from what we learned from the HIV pandemic. So I'm not going to talk about the vulnerabilities that were revealed because none were revealed. We all knew them ahead of time. But I'd like to talk about the strengthening or the deepening of these inequalities linked to the policies that were implemented. And I'm referring to what you said when you talked about the pandemic as an object of government. We need to better understand what politicians can do to strengthen certain inequalities. So we need to have a double understanding. First, intersectional understanding to go beyond statistics. Okay, Black people in all countries in the world were the most affected by morbidity, mortality, but we also need, and of course I'm talking in front of an audience that knows that perfectly well, but we also need to take into account the concepts of race, but also gender and social class. And I'd like to focus on social class concepts, which were probably not taken so much into account as compared to gender or race inequalities. And the second notion that we need to take into account is a process-based analysis of inequalities. When we talk about inequalities and COVID-19, it has an impact on many areas in risk exposure, inequality in access to prevention means, inequalities in access to treatment, inequalities in the way people are managed by healthcare professionals, inequalities in the risk to die, inequality in the risk on mental health, etc., etc. So I'm not going to go any further, but I think this cross-section understanding allows not thinking about the cause and effects of the pandemic, but focusing on social groups. And I'd like to say that maybe we need to use another word than the word pandemic, which is to me ill-adapted to the situation, because in this cross-sectional reading, how can we understand the epidemic versus the risk? In many countries at the beginning, the epidemic affected the male high-income white populations, and then it shifted to Black low-income classes and female, just to make it short. And the lockdown encouraged this social shift of the epidemic with regards to the working condition of the population. I mean, just one figure, even though Judith said that statistics don't help us understand everything, but they provide a framework. And in France, in a recent survey, the prevalence of the epidemic, which was of 7% in November 2020, so people who had been in contact with the virus, and it was the same level for women and for men. If you look at orderlies, female orderlies, it was 17%. And if you take a non-white female orderlies, it was 28%. you look at men, well, from a sociological perspective, they're not orderlies in hospital. There are scarcely any male orderlies in hospitals. But just to show you that lockdown measures, the way they were implemented, they have deepened inequalities in connection with working conditions, etc. It's not the black people who are more affected, it's black people who live in certain conditions, in certain overcrowded housing, who have to go to work using public transportation. So it's a combination of A plus B plus C plus D that leads to a shift from 7 to 28% for black female orderlies in hospitals. And we could do the same for when it comes to healthcare, to mental health issues. And we see that there are huge social discrepancies. The second example is about access to vaccines. We had people who were hesitant with regards to vaccines. And then a few months later, we had vaccine practices. And it's very interesting to study that in the face of the vaccine politics in France that was based on epidemiological vulnerability criteria. So elderly people and people with comorbidities without taking into account any other social social criteria. And we saw that racial minorities, lower income racial minorities were less vaccinated than others. So from hesitancy to non-vaccination, the shift was, or the move was even faster in certain social groups. So these people from lower income communities protected themselves even more by using the mask, by using the test, but they didn't want to receive a vaccine. Why? It's probably an experience of discrimination and experience of discrimination in the healthcare system in particular. So I'll stop here to allow other panelists to speak, but I just wanted to shed some light on what Judith was saying. For these prevention action to work, there are always populations which are dispensable. There are social groups which are more dispensable than others for these prevention actions to work. And the question I'm asking, and I'm not a specialist in ancient Greek, but the word pandemic doesn't work. It has a performative aspect. Pandemic means affecting everyone, and this one does not affect everyone. These epidemics that develop, that grow in a country, on a continent, or at global level, they systematically affect specific social groups. Therefore, the word pandemic doesn't work out to me. Maybe we could call it a peoplemic or pletemics to refer to pletos. Oh, sorry, I'm Nathalie Bajos. I'm a sociologist and a demographer, and I work with INSERM and the School of High Studies in Social Sciences, and I work on issues relating to gender.
Thank you very much. My name is Pascal Moulinier. I am a social psychology professor at a university in the outskirts of Paris in the 93 department, Seine-Saint-Denis. So I'm a psychologist. So I listen to people, and I listen mainly to caregivers, healthcare professionals that are mainly female, but I also listen to people who have psychological problems and live in Seine-Saint-Denis. So just to give you an idea of, you want me to speak louder? Okay, I'm going to end up swallowing the microphone. So I want to come back to vulnerability briefly, because you, Jacques Rancière, you talked about it at the end of your discussion with Judith Butler. I'm under the impression that vulnerability is something we should think about, not about vulnerability of other people. It's not vulnerability of vulnerable people, but we are vulnerable. As a species, we are vulnerable. As a species, we're vulnerable, and it becomes worse because of certain factors, certain situations, and it's offset, or sometimes very well offset in certain situations. But for the pandemic, for researchers, professors, we were very well protected. It was sort of like a little bit of heaven for a little while, but populations of Seine-Saint-Denis in the Paris region, they were overexposed. So we live in societies that are different. The French state doesn't work at all, doesn't function at all like the American state. Yet, at the same time, there are areas where the social state is really not very present at all. So what is very interesting is it's only 10 kilometers away from where we are now. So it's really right next door. So it's just something that I would like people to remember, because I'm very sensitive to the idea that there are worlds in the plural. There are worlds that are very close to one another, that they coexist, yet at the same time, there's very little space, very little public space to hear, to listen to the voices of people who live in these spaces that are pretty much where they're pretty much relegated to. So my question is more about what you said, Jacques Rancière. It raises the issue about how to become as science. What can science do after the pandemic? It's a question we should ask ourselves as researchers. So you said the sick people do not become a community. It's not true. Look at HIV. It's something that was absolutely incredible, because it completely changed the way science was made. It was the beginning of what we call participatory science, or citizen-based science, that is really a response to the fact that science is kept by the centralized state, but it's a way of making science that by definition includes the idea of democracy and the idea of a discussion, of a debate. So within science, but also within society, amongst citizens. So I don't know if that's what you were talking about, Nathalie, but something that I think we completely missed as far as this pandemic is concerned. We did not mobilize at all this kind of device, even though this kind of device worked during the pandemic. There was this new in Saint-Denis. For what I know very well, as far as mental health is concerned, there are spaces that are completely varied, heterogeneous. There are users. By that I mean people, that are not right in the head. Off their rockers, people with sentimental, romantic issues. You have witnesses. We have volunteers, people who come that just because they live next door. But we also have researchers. So these spaces are really fragile, really sensitive, but really powerful, that are real spaces of equality, where people like me are going to, slice onions with workers in USAT. When you peel onions, when you slice onions, you're going to end up crying. Everybody's going to start crying. So, tears in their eyes. So it really creates the conditions where there is actual equality. It doesn't create the same kind of relationship to policies, to science. Not the same at all. Relationship that as the one that you could have with, authoritarian science. You talked a lot about science as an authority. It's a much more humble kind of science in its the way that it thinks it can do something. It's not about authority, but rather than creating areas where life can happen and produce spaces where livable space, where space can happen. And I'm going to give the microphone to my friend. Thank you, Pascal. Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Coutreau. I'm a socioeconomist. I'm a specialist of issues of work. And I want to touch on what Jacques Rancière has said. I agree with him about, our inability to think of a world of equals. But conversely to what he said, I think it's what is important to think about is to think about the causes of the pandemic. If we want to think about this world of equality, there's still the zoonoses, contamination by a wild animal, or the assumption that it seems to become more plausible as time goes by and more scientists to be adhering to is an industrial mishap, sort of like a work accident. The virus may have escaped from one of the labs in Wuhan that are known for doing research on coronaviruses and the possibility of the jump to from species to species. So I'm not going to go into the arguments in favor or against that theory, but there are researchers, people who are very important in these fields, believe that the industrial accident is largely plausible, even though it's probably never going to be confirmed 100% because of the way the Chinese authorities really locks out any kind of investigation within the labs. But it's still a very plausible assumption, theory, and I don't think we think about of the political, philosophical, even implications of that theory, because you know in the end, the role of science it doesn't have a dangerous. The techno science is not this lethal kind of role. You talked about the role of science as far as managing the pandemic, but if the techno science, is at the origin of the pandemic, it means that it opens perspectives that makes you dizzy, vertigo on regulation from a policy and social point of view that should be there in scientific research. I went back to read things that I didn't hear a lot about. The Russian H1N1 that killed 700,000 people. It is a flu. It results from an industrial accident. It is not longer contested by anyone. It is a leak. It is not clear what lab, but it's clear that it is a leak. It is an industrial. So it's 1977, the Russian flu. It didn't give rise to a discussion, to a debate on how you could avoid to have this kind of event happening again. So Etienne de Crouluc is a virologist in the CNRS bulletin, so it's not a left-wing publication. In October 2020, that is to say, when the zoonosis theory was still around, he said we cannot not ask ourselves about the theory of the industrial accident and their consequences on the political regulation of scientific research. And he says, in a scientific world that is where competition is the most important thing to get to results, it's not so much benefits that is at stake. It's more prestige, for to be published in the most prestigious reviews. This kind, so it makes it even more likely, with consequences that can even become more serious, increasingly serious. So, in my opinion, it puts on the table a debate, a discussion that, strangely enough, really doesn't really take place in the kind of circles, research circle or political circles that I'm part of, trying to think about how we go from science guided by a productivist extraction of virus to extract from it new property, to going from that to science that would be that would take the common vulnerability into account, with care at the heart, with that at the heart, to think, to rethink organization of scientific work. First of all, whistleblowers, they're just people, workers, people who are at the source of that accident. When that happens, when there's a leak, it's manipulation, it's the handling, or it's the transportation. It's important that whistleblowers can warn about the danger for society, and how do you determine research, what kind of subsidies are you going to give to these labs? I want to know what you think about the fact that this kind of discussion is completely underdeveloped, when in turn I believe there's a lot at stake. Jean-François Lahaye, I'm a professor at Paris 8. Good afternoon. Just one question to Jacques Rancière on public health, on science and public health. Was under the impression. Does it work? Does the microphone work? Okay. I was under the impression that given if you look at HIV, where there was incredible silence in 1985 and 1995, where it seemed like public health didn't seem to have any impact on any kind of practice, on any reflection or action campaign. I was under the impression, I don't know if you share my view, that we got lessons on biology, virology, demography, an hour or two every evening, 365 days a year. There were lessons, there were debates, there were professors that come from the health professionals, professors that were discussing, that were evaluating, assessing things. We could even have a multiple choice question next Sunday with the election, with 50 words asking people about their knowledge of public health, and you will realize that people have debated a lot, have discussed a lot. How many deaths are you okay with? 450 deaths, impossible. 350, unbearable. 225, not so good. Today it's 100 per day. Okay, all right. Okay, that's all right. 100 per day, it's all right. It's the issue of the value of the life of one person. That's how I'm under that impression. It's an issue that is very moving, that can change all the time, where large swaths of society are starting to think, to reflect on the value of life, the value of a dead person, of an old person dying, being dead. So public health, the knowledge of public health, in my opinion, is completely digested. Now a part of the population has made it their own. So this is my impression, and I wanted to know what your impression was. So my name is Jean-François Haré. So he didn't listen. There's another person in the room. I don't know if there are a lot of people on Zoom. Maybe we can give the floor to the two people on Zoom, and then, or do you want to do it in two separate parts? But we're going to lose time because that's going to be a lot of questions. Evelyne Perrin, good afternoon. I'm economist, and I also advocate in what we could call the alternative world. I want to congratulate the two speakers, but I want to touch on something that Jacques Rancière said. He was talking about our inability to act, and I want to say three things on that. First of all, during the pandemic, there were experiences of solidarity. There were numerous people who have nothing, as Macron would say, l'après-m. The McDonald's in Marseille, in the northern neighborhoods, it had already been taken over by the workers after it was closed. They distributed thousands of food parcels that they made themselves, that they distributed. There's just one example, but there were thousands of examples like that. So it means people took their fate in their own hands, and they were experiences of solidarity that were very impressive. Second point, something that I take part in, there were a lot of us at the end of the pandemic with working from home, that public services disappeared, everything is dematerialized. The fact that algorithm, for instance, if you look at Pôle emploi or CAF, those algorithms are used to completely cut out people, the ones who cost the most money to these subsidies systems. There's a report that's going to come out about the crazy thing happening in the family subsidies on the family subsidy website, the CAF. So we're talking about the dominance of the digital. Every Wednesday, we go to the Bourse du Travail. There are other initiatives in other places in France, so that people become aware very quickly in the way that the governments and financial powers, have dominion over the digital, and there is resistance that is organizing in a very impressive way that's really quick and very impressive. Third point is how science is used. Science is all powerful, is all efficient, and then we realize it's absolutely horrible at what they do. Of course, people with vaccines are not as sick, but they still get sick. We saw that the vaccine had not been experimented enough before it was used. People went to alternative care, that kind of care that always has existed, and that is things that happened in civilizations that are other than Western societies. Civilizations are now used. So we're going to give the floor back to Jacques and Judith, and then we'll give the floor to the people who have asked questions on Zoom. But first, we're going to get the answers from Jacques and Judith.
Not a long answer, please. No, I'll answer what I can answer. So I fully agree with everything that was said, but a couple of points though. Maybe what I said was not proper, was misinterpreted when I said that sick people do not form a community. There are different things I can say. Of course, there is the HIV experiment, but it's not the community of sick people. It's sick people that already belong to a community, for the major part of them. So it's not being sick that brought them into a community. And then it's a type of disease that was very different. These were people. Sorry? No, we're talking about HIV. These are people who met with and got together to fight a disease that evolved rather slowly. But it's not the same thing when you have a pandemic like COVID-19, where you can be in perfect health on Monday and dead on the Friday, or you can be submitted to lockdown orders. So, but you're right. There is some knowledge that developed about the virus, but that was something that was difficult to achieve in the condition of the coronavirus. So you're right. I would say sick people don't form a community as sick people. For HIV, the disease was affecting a community which was already stigmatized and that was already organized. So the situation is a bit different in my mind. So now, what can we learn from what could have we learned from HIV in combating other viruses? Well, I don't know if that's all that easy to draw a parallel here. Now, with regards to the cause, what's striking is that when investigating causes, the so-called very remote cause failed. Many people said, okay, it's simple. Anthropocene, capitalocene, deforestation, climate change. the fracture in the relationship between humans and animals, and everything that was said about pangolins. I mean, we all went back to the revolution of the fire. But at one stage, we realized that great explanations about causes and effects, they exist before the situation that they have to explain. They pre-exist what they have to explain. So now, if we talk about an accident at a lab, then we're talking about something that illustrates the monopoly of official science, of public authorities, and then we have to resort to a mode of analysis that's totally different from the one that was put forward at the very beginning, saying, well, it's our mistake as humans, we're destroying the planet, etc., etc. So, yes, there is a use of causality that blinds us sometimes to the reality of situations and to the reality of processes. So, yeah, but I have no objection to what was said on the other topics. Test of solidarity, yeah, there were many demonstrations of solidarities, and we can see them everywhere. What lacks is the possibility to actually build an alternative world at a global level. Otherwise, yes, we are in a world where you see experiments of equality practices everywhere at local level, and you see the expression of solidarities at local level. That's undeniable. And this is not what I was talking about. I was just talking about the impossibility to offer an alternative that would be a collective awareness of the situation. And
thank you. I'm reminded how much we all want to speak after having been separated from one another for a very long time. And there are so many things to say, so that's part of what I'm experiencing here. I also see the absolute need for interdisciplinary conversation. The pandemic is an interdisciplinary phenomenon, and those on the popular media who are telling us the science are not necessarily those who can pose the question, what is the value of a life, or what do we think about the calculations being made such that a certain amount of death is acceptable, right? I mean, we need ethicists or philosophers or people who think about values from anthropology or religion to actually enter into those conversations. So, so the pandemic is an interdisciplinary object. That's what I'm hearing. And of course, a political, a sociologist who is empirical will be able to insist that we think about the particular conditions under which we are talking about vulnerability or differential vulnerability, and a psychologist who's teaching or practicing outside of the city will be able to tell us more about science as a practice and as an interaction, and what the how the authority is contested, how the authority is accepted, how the rules are played with in order to get by or get through in some way. I think all of this is extremely important, and I myself have learned a great deal from science writing and science education in the last 2 years, just listening to stories that scientists tell, or moving among podcasts or books that do disagree with one another. And it's important to remember that scientific paradigms are very often in conflict with one another, and that they don't speak with a single voice. So the idea of the authority of science is sometimes a lie that seeks to cover over the fact that there are very serious disagreements among scientific paradigms, and that this has always been the case. And there are also huge interpretive questions and frank confessions of ignorance. But I do think it's a moment to think about popular science education as a way of introducing us to multiple paradigms and helping us to judge what we are being told the science is and how we go about making good judgments rather than simply being in the situation of consenting to an authority. That is a false sense of freedom. That's a reductive, it's not just a reductive sense of freedom, but it's a form of freedom that serves the authority of the state itself. So I think Jacques and I do agree that freedom must be thought outside of that logic. And we haven't actually done that yet here today, but I'm not sure we can. In addition to public health mobilizations, I'm also seeing new forms of unionization that are mindful of what work conditions are and why life and death is a matter of work and work conditions. So the recent success in New York City of the Amazon workers to unionize is just a breakthrough moment for us, and I hope it comes to you soon. And let's make that a global movement. I mean, that's really just enormously important. I am not sure. I am not sure that that my view is intersectional. Maybe it is. That would be interesting. I think when Americans speak about gender, class, and race, or that if you mention race, you are therefore intersectional. But intersectionality is one very good, interesting framework developed in law for considering multiple factors in a social position and in a field of social power. But it's not the only position on race, and it's not the only anti-racist position. So intersectionality has a specificity for me that I think has been lost as it's traveled. It's a legal doctrine and an important one that I think has made enormous contributions. But I do think it's important to name the groups that are that compose the part of those who have no part. So I think our abstractions sometimes have to go into more clear descriptions, more clear histories, and even narratives of what it is to live as a group that is considered to be not a part of the common world, and to get textured descriptions in specific locations and histories, that they inform our abstractions as much as our abstractions can help us pose questions. But our theories always have to be challenged by those we meet and the practices we study, because we also have to change our theories when what we find is not what we expect. In any case, I think that's all I really have to say at this point.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we are going to take questions from people who ask questions from Zoom, and maybe then we can listen to more people from the room. 2 people from Zoom, and then 2 from the room. We have many hands going up in the air. At least 4 hands going up in the air. can't hear you. Well, we do hear you. Don't worry. Okay, we can't see you, but we can hear you. Go ahead. May I ask my question? Yes, please go ahead. Okay. So first, thank you so much, Jacques Rancière and Judith Butler, for this excellent conference. Thank you, Elena and Aurélie, for organizing this conference. My question is it possible to have the good life in a post-pandemic world, or are we increasingly restricted to a simple life? I'm Angelo Soares, and I work with the University of Quebec in Montreal. Hello? Yes, go ahead. Can you hear me? Yes, absolutely, we can. Well, I can't hear you anymore, but I'd like to ask a question. Well, first, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank you for this initiative because, yes, at last, we are starting to talk and think about this pandemic that happened all of a sudden, and we can start reflecting, and it feels good, and it echoes what Judith Butler was saying before. I'd like to say a few things. First, Jacques Rancière was talking about the fact that we don't necessarily need to learn any lessons from the HIV crisis. However, we need to understand that there is a parallel here, because something was set up, a public space that opposed and that argued against the operation of medicine, of the medical sector. And all of a sudden, sick people stepped in and took on a role in medical science. And for me, that's a big victory of HIV patients. And I'm going to talk about the situation in France. I'd like to apologize to Judith Butler, but there are things I'm not familiar with in the American system. But the question that arises, and I think this is a question that was addressed by Jacques Rancière, is the question about a political experience of COVID and of the disease, and the absence of the state. I have no answer to that, but there are many questions that we can ask ourselves, and one of the question in this way we operate is probably the univocal debate around vaccination. If you talk to a certain number of doctors, whether GPs or herbal doctors or non-traditional doctors, they all had a feeling that their patients had been confiscated from them. That's one thing, because there is this central nature of the medical discourse that was dispensed by the state. And all of a sudden, it eradicated, it cancelled all debates about the disease, what it was for you, what it was for me in this context of infection. And that's something important. I think it's an important question when we talk about the difficulty of generating a momentum and having people accept vaccines. Second thing that was addressed by Jacques Rancière and by Evelyne Perrin, it's the issue of all this knowledge and all these reflections about medical science and about other medical science and other relationship to body that were crucial in the history of feminist movements and in the history of AIDS patients. And this relationship to the body was not expressed, including in an interaction with the medical world. And I don't know what went on in the US, but I know that in France, the single voice of the central state thinking that will only cure people through the vaccine, and with vaccine becoming almost mandatory, that was also a very significant factor. And from there, we could start rethinking about AIDS patient, because there is a very ambiguous relationship between money, capitalism, medical capitalism, and vaccinal or vaccine capitalism today. And this could lead us to yet another question, and not with just one single voice. Once again, I have no answer, but we could start talking about developing countries and about the fact that they had no access to vaccines because vaccines were being hoarded by big countries and not distributed by big pharma such as Pfizer. Okay, sorry for Judith. I do apologize. It's very Franco-French, but you will probably find interesting materials, but my experience is totally French. Okay, we are going to take the 4 questions from the room now, but they will be without answer because we have 5 minutes to round up our session. So we'll give you the floor so that you can ask your questions, and then I don't know if we can prolong our sessions by 5-10 minutes, not more than that, because we have interpreters and we can't ask them to stay for an additional hour.
Thank you very much. My name is Fatiha Halahi. I'm a researcher on economics. Both of you, I would like to thank you, first of all, for your presentations, for the discussion. Both of you have said, we are talking about the inequalities, and something that was also touched on by the last speaker is you're talking about vaccines and southern countries. I believe the question is more complicated, is a more complex issue. When the pandemic started, it started in the north, first of all. It's something, it was, someone said it was white male because they were traveling more than the other one. Someone said it, and Africa was the last continent to be touched. So things were sort of inverted. So it's something that we should not forget, which is that one of the power in the north is based on superiority, the idea of being in a more democratic, more rich, better access to medicine, superiority. That's what it's based on. So in Western countries, suddenly people felt like they were in the third world with, faced with a disease, no mask, no medicine, no drug, just paracetamol. So the gap between them and the developing countries suddenly disappeared. When emerging countries started to gain and growth, and we looked at the index, the human development index, to create that distance against that. So here the distance was created again in 2 ways. First of all, by stressing, polarizing on very expensive vaccines, very sophisticated vaccines, very difficult to access, that was depriving European countries in accessing the ones that didn't want to have the RNA messenger, were denied the vaccine. In the third world, for instance, China, or even Russia, we can put it, all those vaccines were accessible in third world countries and protected people, something that people don't talk about. I know that people that had the Russian or the Chinese vaccines were protected no less than us with the Pfizer vaccine, because the Omicron wave completely destroyed all of this. So rich countries in two different ways managed to recreate through this difficulty access vaccine because of the temperature, all the whole logistics to be able to implement it. So in the third world countries, the difference was created not because to travel, not just the elite, not just them. It's not just the elite that travel. Also the migrants, they have to have the NRA messenger to be able to get on the plane. So in the third world countries, there are two categories of people: the ones that got the Russian or the Chinese vaccine, or even Cuba, they have their own vaccines. South Africa also have their, so they did catch up. So the elite, they want to have access. That is why the WHO put stress on that. They want to have the RNA messenger vaccine because they want to be able to travel. The second way of creating a difference is public debt. So a lot of money has been spent, and I will go very quickly on this and end with this. Public debt at one point, if there is no growth, it will have to be paid back. And what will happen? Inflation and war. War, in my opinion, is one way of solving the debt issue of European countries. And I think when we think of Ukraine, we really have to keep that in mind. Thank you. Be as quick as possible because we won't be able to give the floor to everyone. Since we don't have very much time, I'm just going to talk about just one point, even though I would have loved to talk about all other points. I'm a sociologist anthropology professor at Paris 8. I will go very quickly about just one point. We need to underline the fact about the exceptionality of certain deaths compared to others, their value or not. In the French context, that's something that needs to be kept in mind. It's just before the pandemic, in the context of a presidency that's lost credibility completely, I think COVID does have a very important factor in that. The mistrust leads to what the situation we're in today. That is to say, fascism is very present, is very tangibly present in France, and I believe that is really what creates the environment in which the elections are going to take place. We're going to vote at the end of the week. People tend to forget that with the pandemic, it created a climate of expression in ordinary law. The SILT law in 2017 at the end is the law that he managed to get passed as quickly as possible. So in 2017, it was taking over bodies very quickly, and it was talking about foreign bodies, minorities, racialized people, Muslims. All these categories are seen as an external and internal threat. I think that's the climate in which the pandemic happened, and is going to bring back a lot of authorities that must prevail, that must be heard, to the detriment of the others. On March 7th, 2020, just before the beginning of the pandemic, just before the first lockdown, there was a whole national mobilization against a law that was supposed to make science and research profitable in France. So that's part of the environment in which science is brought to heal, and it started then and it continued during the pandemic. So that's what I wanted to underline. There were many other things I would like to say. Everyone has to talk 1 minute, or we'll have to stop here because we are already our time is up already.
It would have been perhaps a different discussion to ask what is the relationship between the pandemic and rising fascism, or what is the relationship of the pandemic and the move towards state control and state control over particular communities of bodies, especially at the border, which we're now seeing intensified in the war in Ukraine as well. And I think that would be different. I think asking the question of inequality is maybe it's important, but usually when we are speaking about inequality, we imagine an already constituted group, and then we ask, well, what are the unequal relations within that group? But if we're talking about groups that are bordered by nation states or groups that are defined by virtue of exclusion, then we actually have to think of another question, which is who even counts as a life, who even counts as a member of the society about which we are asking. So, this is also, I think, part of Jacques' contribution to make us think about those exclusions that form the boundaries of community and what the mobilizations can be from these provisional outsides. But I think as well that maybe the contemporary question is fascism and a new form of fascism that it does not necessarily follow the models that we have from the 20th century. I know that some people think they know what fascism is on the basis of the history of fascism that they have studied. And of course, there are elements of fascism that continue. But we do have new forms, and there is a biopolitical fascism that we need to think about now. It's one thing to worry about authoritarianism, which we see, but I think when we're looking at Orban or Putin or Trump or Le Pen, for instance, I think we are talking about neo-authoritarian forms of fascism. And these are new formations, and they are intensified by the pandemic in the same way that corporate profits have been. And maybe that larger conversation would have addressed some of the issues that have been raised by the audience. But thank you very much for having me here. I think I understood most of what you said. I'm sorry if I missed some key moments.
So Helena is asking me to answer more specifically, to give hope, to answer the question of a good life. Yes, I believe that question is somehow determined by this kind of, the naked life, bare life, the Agamben, what he said, that he's saying that the pandemic was sort of a panic and that suddenly people sort of focused only on life itself. My analysis is completely the opposite, and I agree with Judith said and other people have said, is that no, in a certain way you can say the pandemic was also a situation in which there were new forms of solidarity that were created, that were developed more and more or less active. But I believe it is clear that right from the start, what was at stake, the issue, with all the lockdowns, the different kind of measure, was not just survive, but also maintain the conditions to have a rich life, to have a life based on relations, a life based on openness to others. I believe the conditions of a good life are not at all worse than they were before. It's kind of like another question, but I do not believe at all that the pandemic has made them disappeared at all, has canceled them at all. I wanted to say Nathalie Bajos is asking for the French review of sociology papers on the long-term effects of the pandemic. We would like to thank Judith Butler and Jacques Rancière for the communications and their many the many things they said. Thank you very much. And finally, we would like to thank all of the members of CRESPA that organized this meeting. Nadia Hachami, Vincent Fernea, Sandra Nicolas, Thomas Guiffard, Jean-René Borelli, and Jean-Yves André of the Fouché site UAR. We would all like to thank the interpreters Philippe Bignet, Catherine Laurent, and Valérie Merle. Thank you very much.